So in this next lecture, we are going to talk about one of the more perplexing ideas of exercise physiology that has kind of recently changed into a completely new thought process. And that is the idea of, is lactate a good or bad molecule? In lab, we're going to spend a lot of time on this and talk quite a bit more. So I hope you find this interesting, because if not, you're going to have another hour of it coming soon. But so what is the lactate threshold and the onset of blood lactate accumulation? A lot of times these get lumped in together, but I want to make it an important point that these are two separate phenomena that occur with lactate threshold. So again, we'll circle back to what is lactate, where is it coming from, and what is it doing? If you remember, we produce lactate when essentially glycolysis is being performed in order to meet metabolic demand, and that pyruvate that is created at the end of it isn't shuttled into the electron transport chain because of a insufficient supply of oxygen as the final electron acceptor. So what happens is, in a DH builds up in the cell, we need to recycle that. The way we do that is by the enzyme Lactate Dehydrogenase converting pyruvate into lactate. Then in that reaction, we recycle NADH into NAD. It can then go back and perform its duties in glycolysis, and we have lactate as a byproduct. I'll mention briefly, we can also take lactate back into pyruvate, and so that's still a possibility. And the liver, if you remember the Cori cycle, can take lactate and turn it back into glucose. Right? But here we're talking about the idea of lactate building up in the blood. So this is at higher intensities, and the higher the intensity workload, right, the more that we're going to require glycolysis to proceed, and in that idea that lactate will eventually start to increase in the blood because of our lack of ability to get rid of it. So we'll start to produce more, and we'll have a lack of ability to get rid of it. So there's two definitions that you need to know. Again, these get lumped in a lot of times with each other, but they are completely different. The first is lactate threshold, sometimes called LT1. So this is the exercise intensity at which blood lactate exceeds the resting concentration. A resting concentration is normally 1 millimolar. Right? So if we start to see a rise in blood lactate over 1, then we would say a person has reached their lactate threshold. In an untrained subject, this is usually around 50% of their maximal oxygen consumption value. Training can improve this. So we can exercise at a higher intensity before reaching threshold, and it's anywhere from 65 to 80% of VO2 max. So that's point number 1. A second point occurs later on, and this is an exercise intensity at which blood lactate concentration reaches 4 millimolar, and I'm going to redraw the figure that they have in the book because I don't love it. But what happens when they reach 4 millimolar is the lactate concentration in the blood just shoots up, rockets up. One point we'll make before we get into that is, if you remember, or one point that we want to talk about is lactate has gotten a terrible, terrible rap. 1, people have said that lactate causes DOMS. It does not. 2, we say lactate has caused the acidity in the muscle. Right? This is not true. So indeed, when pyruvate is converted by LDH, it is converted into lactic acid, but that lactic acid is rapidly converted into lactate. So, right, lactate is no longer lactic acid, and some people attributed that acid then form as causing a change in pH. It doesn't. The acidity comes from ATP breakdown, which increases hydrogen ion concentration and thus acidity, and that's causing the decrease in performance. For a very long time, people said lactate was causing acidity in the muscle. That acidity in the muscle was causing muscle fatigue and decreases in performance, and therefore you wanted to stay away from your lactate threshold. We now know better. However, it's still powerful. Let's talk about what the lactate threshold looks like in graph form. So here we have both a trained and an untrained subject. In the untrained subject, again, you'll see here's 1 millimolar. This graph does a pretty good job keeping it here. So lactate threshold occurs again at that point greater than 1. So LT is greater than 1 millimolar. Okay. And then you'll start to see, once we reach that point is important because we see an inflection. We see the slope of this line increases, and we start to increase the amount of lactate in the blood. And then in the second point here, once we reach about 4 millimolar, the reason I don't love this is because the slope of this line changes rapidly, right? So they show just this exact same slope. They have a nice little line. But what happens is once you reach 4, then you go from like 4 to 8 really fast, or 4 to 10 really fast. So this is a relatively slow pursuit. Onset of blood lactate accumulation, you go really fast. This figure is straight out of the book, and I don't love it, but I'm making sure to cover it here in lecture so that you can see the difference. Again, lactate threshold, 0.1, anything above the resting concentration of 1 millimolar, and then at 4, then we see an even more rapid rise. That slope changes. Exercise training improves lactate threshold, as you can see. Again, a little bit hint that maybe resting concentration is a little lower. Once we hit 1, we see an increase in slope, and then here, again, I prefer to do that, and those should be pretty well on top of each other. So again, once they reach 0.2, which is OBLA, onset of blood lactate accumulation is 4 millimolar. Okay. And the important part of this is that exercise training can improve lactate metabolism and make it where you can exercise at a higher intensity and before lactate starts to build up in the blood. So why is that? So lactate threshold occurs for a couple reasons. Why is this adaptation? Again, first, it allows for the maintenance of a higher intensity before switching to anaerobic metabolism as compared to the untrained, right? So we have better trained ability to do this. So why can we use aerobic metabolism longer? One is an important concept is that we switch to metabolizing lipid. So in your book, they talk about this. There's an entire section on this, on substrate utilization changes with exercise. I'm just going to touch on it here. Make sure you go read that. But one of the crucial adaptations is with exercise training is we become better butter burners, is a good way to think of it. When you exercise train, you burn fat better than an untrained individual. We can then use that to avoid using glycolysis, avoid producing lots of pyruvate entering the mitochondria, and can generate lots of ATP from fat. Again, a better butter burner is a good way to look at it. And think about it. Exercise training improves our ability to metabolize lipid. We also have an increased number of enzymes in the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Part of this is due to just an increase in mitochondria, right? We learned that in the muscle unit, is that we have better and more mitochondria that have more enzymes in them. The more enzymes that we have, the more pyruvate we can process, the more ATP we can generate. And then we have more electron transport chain complexes, so we can push them all down the line. Essentially, if you think about this as an assembly line, right? We can think about if you have one line coming through and you're pushing glucose all the way through the line, that's great. How much faster can you generate that product or box it up or whatever if you had 2 assembly lines going? And if you had 3 assembly lines, you could go even farther. Same thing happens with exercise. We get more enzymes of the Krebs cycle, more mitochondria that essentially act as assembly lines to make more ATP. And then we also have an increase in capillary density and number. This does 2 things. One, it increases the amount of oxygen we can get to our muscles to act as that final electron acceptor. 2, it allows that lactate shuttle that we talked about yesterday of having 2 fates. One, we can send it to other muscles in the bloodstream and they can be used, or we can shuttle it back to the Cori cycle and can use it a little bit more efficiently. So again, this is the idea. Exercise training makes aerobic metabolism at its best. We got more mitochondrial density and volume, increased blood supply and capillaries in the muscle, increased myoglobin so that we can deliver oxygen and can really just churn oxidative metabolism, rely less on glycolysis, and therefore prevent the increase in lactic acid. So what is lactic acid at this point? That's a really good question, right? So why do we care? I just told you in the previous slide that lactic acid doesn't cause acidity, doesn't cause fatigue, and that's true. Actually, we now believe that lactate has no major negative impacts on exercise performance. I know, that's a big shock, right? That is counterintuitive to what most people have been taught or learned for a really long time, and we're just kind of coming around to this idea. So then why am I even talking about lactate? So one of the most important things about lactate is because it is relatively easily measured and is a great use for a training tool, right? So you can measure it just like using a blood glucose analyzer that you guys have used in previous classes here on campus. It's just a finger prick. You can get a quick lactate concentration, and that is important because we can use it to alter our training program. One of the things that is important to note is although it doesn't cause fatigue, it is closely related to fatigue, right? So when you hit onset of blood lactate accumulation, you are going to get tired and fatigued, and your performance is going to suffer, very, very closely related to that. It's not caused by it, but they happen at about the same time, so we can use it as a wonderful biomarker, right? So what you want to do is when you're trying to train your lactate threshold, you want to work above it. So you know what intensity it takes to work above that. That'll help you improve that. And then at the competition, right, you want to work right at that threshold so that you don't lose performance, but that's as high as you can go before fatigue will set in. So that's how we use lactate in performance and why is it important in metabolism.